Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our program, Our Science, Ourselves, How Gender, Race, and Social Movements Shape the Study of Science. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the public libraries in Ashland, Bedford, Brookline, Marlborough, Needham, Tewksbury, and Wayland for partnering with us on this program. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A and Christa will answer them at the end of the program. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of the book online, I can add the link for Bookends in the chat. If you would like a signed copy, Christa will be signing her book at Maxima Booksellers in Lexington on Monday, March 10th from 6 to 7 p.m. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Christa Kuljian is a historian of science, a science writer, and the author of two other books, Sanctuary and Darwin's Hunch, Science, Race, and the Search for Human Origins, both of which are held at Cary Library. Darwin's Hunch was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Alan Paton Award for Nonfiction. Christa went to Lexington High School in the class of 1980 and studied the history of science at Harvard, class of 1984. She has lived in South Africa for over 30 years and is a research associate at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at Wits University in Johannesburg. Welcome, Christa. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for having me. And thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you for all the other partnering libraries. It's really a pleasure to be with you this evening. And I thought I'd start by, telling a little bit about how I came to write this book. And you might have guessed how I came to the title, Our Science, Ourselves, which is really in tribute to the revolutionary, iconic women's health book, Our Bodies, Ourselves. So the title is a nod to Our Bodies, Ourselves, the 1970s, Boston, the women's movement at that time. Given that Our Bodies, Ourselves was created and written by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. I had a copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves when I was in high school. Perhaps many of you did and still turn to it as well. Another inspiration for this book for me came from when I was studying. I took a class called Bio 109, Biology and Women's Issues, when I was a history of science student at Harvard in the early 1980s. Took that course with Ruth Hubbard, biologist Ruth Hubbard. And on our reading list was this book, Women Look at Biology Looking at Women, edited by Ruth Hubbard and others, where they had started to really critique how the entire discipline of biology looked at women or portrayed women and took on many stereotypes. So that book and that course stayed with me. Another inspiration came much later, but was also drew from the fact that I had studied the history of science. And that was the fact that I wrote a book called Darwin's Hunch, Science, Race, and the Search for Human Origins. Helen mentioned that. And I really immersed myself into the archives in South Africa to try to look at the history of paleoanthropology and the search for human origins, and how scientific racism really was embedded in that effort in the early 20th century. And so after writing one book about the history of science, I was looking around for what topic to turn to next and decided it was time to go back and look again at Bio 109, Ruth Hubbard's course that I had taken all those years ago, and to see, what were other women scientists, other feminist scientists thinking and writing at the time, and what were some of those networks. So my research led me to a group of 7 women. This is a group of 6 of them who, the 3 women on the left, on your far left in the top is Ruth Hubbard, again, biologist, the first woman to receive tenure at Harvard in 1974 in the biology department. Rita Arditti in the top center, geneticist, and we're going to return to all of these women. This is just an introduction. Evelynn Hammonds on the top right, studied physics at Spelman and Morehouse and Georgia Tech, did her master's in physics at MIT. On the bottom left, Evelyn Fox Keller, also a physicist and a historian of science. And Fausto-Sterling spent her career at Brown University in developmental biology, and Banu Subramaniam on the bottom right, an evolutionary biologist. So it was interesting to discover the network of women and how they supported one another, and their life stories intersect at various points. So really, it's the work of these 6 women, plus one, who I follow in the book. Their writing over the decades, their scientific work, and also not only their work to encourage women in science, but also to look closely at how science portrays women, and also about the feminist analysis of many fields in science. This is Nancy Hopkins. And Nancy Hopkins in the 70s and 80s really did not want to have anything to do with feminism. She says that to me point blank. Nancy, a shout out to you. Nancy Hopkins is a Lexington resident. She spent many years at MIT, and it was only in really the mid to late 1990s when Nancy, really said she was a reluctant feminist and came to look at some of the same issues. So we will return to Nancy. But first, let's look at what was happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. A lot of individual women scientists were struggling on their own. And I want to start with Ruth Hubbard. I want to start with a story to tell and a reading from the book. This is a young Ruth Hubbard on the left, and a picture of her with her husband, George Wald, also a biologist, on the right. Ruth Hubbard was originally from Vienna, Austria. Her family fled in 1938. Ruth ended up in Boston with her family, studied biology at Radcliffe. She worked in George Wald's lab throughout the 40s and 50s, focusing on biology and the biochemistry of vision. So studying the eye and the retina and the proteins in the eye. And Ruth Hubbard was very successful in her work, publishing many breakthrough journal articles. She and George Wald got married in 1958, and she continued to work as a research fellow, research associate in the lab throughout the 1960s as well. So I want to read a piece from the book about what Ruth Hubbard experienced in 1967. On a crisp morning in October 1967, the phone rang at Hubbard and Wald's house on Lakeview Avenue in Cambridge. It was for Wald, and when he hung up, he said, "I've won the Nobel Prize." For a moment, the couple was in disbelief. They hadn't been working toward it or expecting it. Their son, Elijah, had already left for school, but they shared the news with 6-year-old Debbie. "We're going to see the King of Sweden," Debbie told the Boston Globe reporter who arrived later that day. Wald shared the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine with the Finnish-Swedish scientist Ragnar Granit and Halden Hartline from Rockefeller University in New York. Hubbard was thrilled for him. She rapidly started preparing for the festivities, found some green silk fabric, worked with a local dress designer, hunting for matching shoes. The whole family flew to Stockholm, and Wald was treated like a film star for a week. The event's brilliantly lighted ballroom felt like a Hollywood set. As Debbie had predicted, the King of Sweden was there, and Elijah sat next to a princess. After dinner, one of the men on the Nobel Committee, the Swedish scientist Hugo Theorell, walked over to where Hubbard was sitting, glamorous in her floor-length off-the-shoulder gown. The champagne was flowing. A quartet was playing. In her elated mood, she thought for a moment he was inviting her to dance. Instead, he said, "You know you were kept out of the prize by the rule of 3. The music stopped. Hubbard stared at Theorell, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but he turned and walked away. Theorell was referring to a rule in Alfred Nobel's will, which guides the presentation of Nobel Prizes. The committee cannot give a prize to more than 3 people at once. In other words, the founder did not want the prize money to be divided into portions that were too small. But Hubbard was flabbergasted. Why had he told her this? Did he think she would feel honored that she had been considered for the award at all? Did he think she would be happy to hear she was 4th? The fact was that she wasn't honored or happy. She was bewildered. At the time, she didn't imagine that perhaps she also should have won, or that sexism had been at play. But many years later, when she was looking back at the moment, she saw it as a dreadful incident. No one on the Nobel Committee would ever have said such a thing to a man. At least some contemporaries were aware of Hubbard's own unheralded role. After the couple returned from Stockholm, they were invited to a potluck dinner party where the talk mainly revolved around the Vietnam War. Standing with her plate, Hubbard was chatting to friends when another person pulled her aside to ask, "Did you win George's Nobel Prize for him?" Hubbard had certainly played a large part in Wald's success. Yet after he won the Nobel, her reputation as a scientist changed dramatically. From that point onward, her research was seen as his work. Moreover, her record in the literature started to read differently. Slowly, Hubbard began to sense that all of her own contributions were being erased. Everything she had ever done was being described as Wald's work. 25 years later, Margaret Rossiter, a historian of science, gave this trend a name, the Matilda effect, and used Ruth Hubbard as an example. As Rossiter was able to show, it was common to subsume a woman scientist's work into the accomplishments of a better-known male colleague. 2 years after Wald's Nobel, Hubbard herself was beginning to notice these discrepancies, and in 1969, her attitude about them was about to change. So in 1969, we meet Rita Arditti, a geneticist. Now, Rita is originally from Argentina. In fact, all of the 7 women in the book, none of them are originally from Boston. They all are from elsewhere and came to Boston to take a job or work in a lab or network with other scientists. So Rita, from Argentina, got her PhD in Italy. She was fascinated by genetics. She then took a post at Brandeis and then settled in at Harvard Medical School in the lab. Now, in the 1960s, she was very focused on her science. And it was really the concern about the Vietnam War that started her thinking about science and militarism, science and society. And it was only after that that she started thinking about women in her field, their position, which was very tenuous. And that led to her leading a protest in December 1969. She led a protest at the American Association for the Advancement of Science conference, the AAAS conference, that was in Boston. You can see on the left a very grainy photo from the Boston Herald Traveler. Sorry, the Boston Herald Traveler, right? And Rita, along with 12 other women, led a protest into a special luncheon for women scientists. So women were sitting at tables having their lunch, white linen, quite formal, and they were very uncomfortable with the protest, which was unannounced. But one of the women sitting there was Ruth Hubbard. And Ruth took interest in what Rita had to say. The protest, as it turns out, was one of the first actions of a fledgling organization. First in Boston, but then also nationally, called Science for the People. Some of you may know of this organization, which was birthed in 1969-70 and continued for 20 years until 1989. It has since had a rejuvenated version, but originally it worked for 20 years. And Science for the People, Rita Arditti was one of the early founders. And they brought 3 resolutions to the AAAS conference. The first was calling for a withdrawal of troops from Vietnam and any related scientific research that was promoting militarism. The second resolution was calling for an end to any use of science in the oppression of Black people, and they made specific reference to the Black Panthers. The third resolution was the one that Rita and her colleagues had drafted about ending the discrimination against women in science. And that resolution, that protest by Rita really had a ripple effect across the years at AAAS and amongst many women, including Ruth Hubbard. And, Ruth, in her papers and her oral histories, which are available in the Schlesinger Library, she spoke about the impact of that moment in 1969 as a turning point for her personally, because previously Ruth Hubbard had thought, well, I'm a scientist, I'm a woman, I'm at Harvard, I'm publishing, I'm doing well. What is the issue? But after that, she started thinking, wait a minute, why have I not received tenure? Why am I still in a junior position after 25 years of major work and contributions? So Ruth and Rita eventually met, talked more, and both became engaged with Science for the People and a group, a subgroup that focused on women's issues. They published a special issue of Science for the People in 1974 that focused on not only issues around women in science, but also looking at how science portrayed women's biology. Ruth wrote a major essay called "Have Only Men Evolved?" I mean, she started to reread Darwin with this changed awareness and had a lot to critique in his perception of male and female, and portraying women as passive and men as active. So another event in the mid-70s that had an impact was that E.O. Wilson published his book, Sociobiology, in 1975. And there was a lot of concern within Science for the People about certain aspects of sociobiology, which was really presenting that it's largely biology that dictates people's destiny and discounting environmental factors. So there was a lot of concern about racist implications, sexist implications. So as a number of women, Ruth and Rita included, started writing and thinking about the, questioning what they had been taught about the objectivity of science. They really started to push back against sociobiology. A group formed in Cambridge, the Sociobiology Study Group, and they were both involved with that. Now, there was another organization in New York called the Genes and Gender Collective at about the same time in the mid-70s that also was concerned about sociobiology. And one of the members of that collective was Dorothy Burnham, also a biologist. She studied biology at Brooklyn College, and she was the head of the Staten Island Hospital lab in New York City. This is a picture taken in 1960 of Dorothy Burnham that her daughter Linda, shared with me. And Dorothy Burnham, even, before she, became a scientist, she was a civil rights activist in the 40s and 50s in the South and in New York. And she always kept her activism and her science separately, as did Ruth Hubbard, as did Rita Arditti, until, again, the women's movement, concern about sociobiology, brought these two things together for the first time. She started writing, Dorothy Burnham started writing for Freedom Ways, an African-American journal. And she spoke at a conference in 1977, and Ruth Hubbard attended that Genes and Gender Collective conference, heard what Dorothy was saying. And Dorothy's message was that a lot of women scientists were concerned about stereotypes that scientists were placing on white women. And she was saying, you also need to look at the very different set of stereotypes that exist for African-American women and enslaved women. So Ruth Hubbard was influenced by that. She and Dorothy Burnham started sharing and working together and publishing together as well. And I'd just like to say that I was fortunate enough to interview Dorothy Burnham. She is now 109 years old and living in Jamaica Plain. And this is a photo of Dorothy Burnham today. She is going to turn 110 on March 22nd, 2025. So I'm just, giving a shout out and great thanks to Dorothy Burnham and your contributions. Now, not only did Dorothy Burnham and Ruth Hubbard and Rita Arditti have an influence on Evelynn Hammonds. So around the same time that these other women scientists were questioning sociobiology, Evelynn Hammonds was starting to study physics. She was at Spelman and Morehouse, and so in 1974, she had an experience that had a great impact on her. And I'd like to read, a little bit of that, share that with you. In 1974, Evelynn Hammonds was studying at Spelman, a historically Black women's college in Atlanta. One day that spring, she walked across the green quadrangle of Morehouse College, a historically Black men's school affiliated with Spelman, where she was taking her physics classes. She entered the red brick building of the physics department, pushed open the heavy wooden door into her classroom, and sat down among a group of students gathered at the front of the room. As she took her seat, she noticed that two Morehouse professors were sitting at the back. The students were gathering to elect officials for the Morehouse and Spelman chapter of the National Society of Physics Students. By a show of hands, they elected a male student as president, a female student as vice president, and another young woman as treasurer. The next open position was secretary, and a woman student put her name forward. Suddenly, one of the young men raised an objection. "You're telling me there's going to be 3 women in the leadership?" he shouted. "We can't have that." Hammonds flinched. She wondered what his problem was. The world was changing. As far as she knew, women had every right to be in this room and every right to lead. Nevertheless, she could feel the tension rising. Another man, one of Hammonds's teaching assistants, leaned forward in his chair and started to complain. "They're taking over," he said. She recalled that he had recently handed back an assignment to her with a handwritten note saying, "You can't be a Black woman and a physicist." Hammonds was already mad at him about that, and now she was seething. The election for secretary deadlocked. One of the men pushed for a roll call vote, that is, asking each person one by one for a verbal vote, and the group agreed. But when one of the men voted for the women candidate, another shouted, "What is wrong with you?" Someone else piped up, "You can't do this." Meanwhile, the 2 professors at the back of the room stayed quiet. Why don't they say something, thought Hammonds. It occurred to her that there were no women faculty in the physics department. The roll call continued, and no one else, including the professors, voted for the woman candidate. In the end, the male candidate was elected as secretary. What was going on? Evelyn, I really want you to understand, the department chair at Morehouse said when she went to talk to him after the election. It's not that I don't think a woman would be good, but you can see that I couldn't vote for a woman. Why not? She demanded, and then walked out, not waiting for his answer. You can't be a woman and a scientist, her boyfriend explained as they walked across campus. Hammonds was stunned. What is your problem? She snapped back. You don't understand, he said. You're going to have to choose. Right, well, that was 1974. So I'm sure we could think about what circumstances are like today. Evelyn Hammonds went to the library often in the mid-70s, looking for information about other Black women scientists. She didn't find much. She didn't find much in general about, women scientists. There wasn't a lot. And one day the librarian said, I have something for you. And she had set aside a report that had come out in January 1976 called The Double Bind, The Price of Being a Minority Woman in Science. Shirley Malcolm, pictured here, was one of the co-authors of the report. And she was based at the AAAS. And it turns out that Malcolm became a mentor to Evelyn Hammonds. And they've gone on to, remain friends and colleagues ever since. And Shirley Malcolm has continued on in this same line of work for the last 50 years. So she has made very important contributions as well. When Evelyn Hammonds moved up to Boston, to Cambridge, to go to MIT, she had been encouraged to apply by Shirley Malcolm, and she was accepted with a scholarship. Once she got there, there was another social movement, activist organization that had an impact on her personally and on her thinking about her career in science. And that was the Combahee River Collective. Several members of the collective are pictured here. Barbara and Beverly Smith. I spoke extensively to Beverly Smith in my research. She has focused on Black women's health, public health throughout her career. Audre Lorde was also a member of the collective. And they put together the Combahee River Collective Statement, which was first published in 1977. And that statement and its impact made it possible for Evelyn Hammonds to say to herself, that she was a woman, she was a scientist, and she was Black. All three aspects were important and could not be pulled apart. So it was another decade or more before the concept of intersectionality was put forward in academia and social sciences. But certainly the Combahee River Collective was doing that important work, even in the 1970s. So it turns out that Beverly Smith also ended up writing and publishing together with Ruth Hubbard. Ruth Hubbard had read some of her writings elsewhere about Black feminism and wanted to bring her work to a broader audience in feminist science. So, so that was all happening in the 1970s. When we get to the 1980s, it was a time in which a lot of women scientists were starting to publish more and network more. And one of those important networking meetings took place in Wellesley, at Wellesley College. And there was an important gathering there in 1984-85. The seminar ran for an entire year, seminar on women and science. And Evelyn Hammonds was a part of that, as was Evelyn Fox Keller and Fausto-Sterling, several philosophers of science like Sandra Harding and Helen Longino. And so it was really an important networking opportunity, people building friendships and relationships, and to start, well, not start, but to build on, you know, what Rita Arditti, Ruth Hubbard had been talking about in the 70s, asking, is science objective? Is it neutral? What are elements of bias that enter into the process of science, the process of putting together research questions, analyzing data. And some of these women started to publish. Evelyn Fox Keller and her important work, Reflections on Gender and Science. So she was not looking at the science of gender. She was looking at issues related to the gender of science. And Fausto-Sterling was wanting to write as well, and she, I want to share a little bit of what her experience was as well from the book. Fausto-Sterling wanted to write a book that would explore how myths about biological sex differences had made their way into scientific thinking about biology. She knew she was well placed as a trained scientist to examine these preconceptions, but she didn't want to jump into a project that someone else might already be doing. So she decided to consult with Ruth Hubbard. Hubbard was very receptive to Fausto-Sterling's proposal. "We need your voice," she said. "We need as many voices as we can get." It was an important moment for Fausto-Sterling. Finally, she had found a way to combine her scientific skills with her work as a feminist. Other conversations were also influential, though not always comfortable. One day, for instance, Fausto-Sterling had lunch with a senior colleague in the Brown History Department. He was interested in the new academic work in women's studies, but couldn't figure out how it could relate to science. With sincere curiosity, he asked, "Don't you have to admit that until Marie Curie, there had been no great women scientists, no women of genius?" She looked at him stunned and uncharacteristically silenced. Every bone in her body felt that his assumptions were wrong, but she had no way to prove it. Margaret Rossiter had not yet published her research, and there was little literature available. Nonetheless, right after lunch, Fausto-Sterling started her own search. Every time she came across an article with a title such as 5 Great Women Mathematicians or Ancient Women Chemist, she copied the piece and put it in a box. As the years passed, the pile of articles grew and grew, but her colleagues' questions still niggled. Then she came across an article titled "The Secret Life of Beatrix Potter" in the journal Natural History. In the late 19th century, well before Potter wrote The Tale of Peter Rabbit, she had been a natural scientist. In her research of lichens, she became the first person in England to observe and describe the symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus. traveling throughout the British Isles to classify fungi, and making detailed drawings to identify types. Then, after she submitted her groundbreaking paper on lichens to the Linnaean Society of London, she received word that she could not share her findings there because women were not permitted at the society's meetings. In the end, her uncle read the paper. But Potter, frustrated by the barriers to women, including lack of access to the British Museum, abandoned science and turned to writing children's books. The story flicked a switch in Fausto-Sterling's head. The Potter story was a tale of erasure. Who else had become invisible? How many other women's work had been lost from view? Never again would Fausto-Sterling be silenced by a question about the lack of women in science. Her epiphany led to her growing interest in the history of science, a fascination she shared with Evelynn Hammonds during their conversations at Wellesley. So Anne Fausto-Sterling started to think about new courses to teach with the new literature. There was the groundbreaking work that Margaret Rossiter was doing. You see here, volume 1 of Women Scientists in America. It ended up being a 3-volume series. There was the work of Ken Manning from MIT, who wrote Black Apollo of Science, about the life of Ernest Everett Just. So these works were integrated in some of the new teaching in the 80s. It was in the mid-1980s that Banu Subramaniam traveled from India to the US. She did her PhD in evolutionary biology at Duke, and she went on to work at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and she is now at Wellesley College. And Banu is the youngest of the scientists I write about in the book. She too was inspired by Ruth Hubbard, Evelyn Fox Keller, Rita Arditti, and Fausto-Sterling, Evelynn Hammonds, and she came to meet many of them and to work with Evelynn Hammonds, and they wrote together. But Banu was particularly interested in how can you take some of this feminist analysis and have an impact on the doing of science, which is something that started to happen in the 1990s. So there were definitely efforts to look at a number of different fields in science, and at the risk of reading too much, I will read one last small piece which describes the work of a woman named Emily Martin in 1991 to talk about how scientists were bringing their biased view into their science of reproduction. In 1991, Emily Martin, a young anthropologist at Johns Hopkins University, published The Egg and the Sperm. Martin recognized that both popular and scientific accounts of reproductive biology relied on stereotypes of male as active and the female as passive. Martin was inspired by Ruth Hubbard's work. Martin's writings analyzed how scientists and the public use harmful metaphors to describe reproduction. For instance, comparisons to economic production and factories. Sperm was repeatedly in textbooks presented as production, whereas female eggs were treated as overstocked inventory. In her writings, Martin repeatedly pointed out that scientific language can affect how scientists view what they are observing. In these texts, the egg was commonly described as large and passive. It did not move or journey, but was transported, swept, or drifted along. In contrast, the sperm was streamlined and active. It delivered its genes to the egg by means of a strong tail and great velocity. As Martin explained, scientists at Johns Hopkins who were working to develop a spermicide contraceptive had found to their great surprise that the forward movement of sperm is extremely weak and that it mostly moves sideways, back and forth. The surface of the egg is what catches the sperm and holds onto it. The two stick together because of adhesive molecules on both surfaces. Nonetheless, in their papers, the researchers continued to treat the egg as the passive partner and the sperm as the active one, if weaker than previously thought. It took the scientists years after first describing their findings to begin to acknowledge the egg as having a more active role. Now, this was not only in biology. Scientists started to look also it was not only in reproductive biology, but it was also in cell biology. And you see here that, portions of the cell on the top right were often described with male and female characteristics. In chemistry, bottom left, molecules that collide were given gendered roles. Also in physics, a number of scientists were starting to look at this same trend. So, in the 90s, this started for scientists to look at a number of different fields. And this was the time at which Nancy Hopkins started to also question her situation in science. Having been very reluctant in the 70s and 80s, by the 1990s, she was struggling at MIT, and she ended up down on her hands and knees with a measuring tape. Many of you may know this story, to determine whether she had as much space, lab space, as the men in her department, and she did not. And that led to her joining with other women scientists at MIT and publishing the MIT Report on Women in Science in 1999. Nancy Hopkins, she had earlier felt that she couldn't, look at issues around discrimination or bias and her science at the same time. But then later in her career, she realized that she did need to look at both. And the MIT report had a major impact. It was reported across media, and it was not the first report of its kind, but it was unique in that it had the support, the president of MIT, Charles Vest. And so it was an illustration of the importance of the power of institutional support. But that did not mean by any means that that was the view at all universities. And it was only 5 years later, some of you may remember the remarks that Larry Summers made in 2005, where he raised a similar issue that had been raised before about women in science. He said that the reason that there were low numbers of women in science was, biological, genetic. He described it as, quote, different availability of aptitude. So when he said that at a conference in January 2005, Nancy Hopkins was in the room, as was Shirley Malcolm from the AAAS, the co-author of the Double Bind report. So they were incensed, and they spoke out against Summers at the time and thereafterwards. as did Evelyn Hammonds and Fausto-Sterling, Ruth Hubbard. By then, Ruth Hubbard was in her 80s, and she described Summers's comments as warmed over sociobiology. The book does not close with Summers, but it closes in the early 2000s with Evelyn Hammonds and Banu Subramaniam having written together, reflecting on the previous 25 years of feminist science studies. And this final slide really just illustrates that this book and this talk is really a tribute to this group of women scientists who have contributed so much over the last 50 years. And their insights, in many ways, have come to infuse mainstream scientific knowledge. And they continue to inspire research and knowledge that shapes our view of the world and of science and ourselves. So thank you very much to them and to all of you in the audience.
Thank you, Christa. It appears that we have a question in the chat from Beverly. Hi, Christa. Could you talk more in detail how Ruth Hubbard found out about Black feminism and specifically the Combahee River Collective? Do you have any specific stories about how and when the women in your book encountered Black feminism and or the feminist movement in general?
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Beverly. It's an honor to have Beverly Smith here on this webinar. Beverly was one of the original founders of the Combahee River Collective, one of the authors of the Combahee River Collective statement. Beverly, thank you. It was very interesting for me to delve into the archives of Ruth Hubbard's papers, also to look at different books that she had edited and where she had, there was one case where she brought out a second edition of a book and wanted to integrate more writing by Black women, women of color. And so I could see how that her trip to New York, her hearing Dorothy Burnham speak in particular had an impact on her. Reading your work, Beverly, was influential to her. So I'm sure you have stories to tell as well. I would love for everyone to hear from you. Please look out for Beverly Smith's writing. She's continued to write many essays and articles. So thank you so much, Beverly. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions at the moment, but I will say that if anyone has any questions that come to mind later, I think Helen has provided my email address, which is christak@alignafrica.com. And just to repeat that I will have an in-person event at Maxima Bookstore on Mass Ave in Lexington on Monday, March 10th at 6 p.m. So please feel free to come then and we can chat more informally then. I look forward to that.
Thank you so much for an enlightening presentation, Christa. One last question before you leave us. What are you working on next?
Well, I'm really looking forward to because I live in Johannesburg, South Africa, doing a number of pieces about women scientists in South Africa as well. I've already worked with a lot of wonderful women paleoanthropologists, given my work in that arena with Darwin's Hunch. I have some other, book plans, related to science and society. I look forward to continuing in that arena.
Thank you so much. Again, if you have any questions that we didn't get to, please email Christa at christak@alignafrica.com. Thank you again, Christa, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Cary Library. Thank you, everyone.